Welcome back to the Dershow. First, some news, starting with the Olympics in Paris. An Algerian Muslim uh, judoka, I guess that's what they call people who fight with each other in judo. Judoka, not to be confused with Judaica. This guy was anything but that. This judoka said he would refuse to fight an Israeli. Doesn't matter, he'd forfeit. He tried that once before and he was suspended. So this time he tried to fake it. He came to the weigh-in and he was 400 grams over the weigh-in, which just meant he drank lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of water and didn't pee. They should have made him stay there for a couple of hours and see what would have happened. But he didn't fight him. And now the Olympic Committee is going to look into it, but only after the Olympics. Also, the Olympic Committee has allowed, there are two Palestinians. They recognize Palestine as a state, and Palestine can have a flag, although Taiwan, which has all the accoutrements of statehood, as a legislature, partly, judiciary, it's a real state. They can't show their flag, but Palestine can show its flag, showing, how politics influences everything at the Olympics. They try. But for the most part, if China wants it, they get it. If Israel wants it, it's another story. Okay, speaking of Israel, we saw over the weekend that Hezbollah attacked a Druze soccer game, killing 12 children and young teenagers. They deny it, but the Israelis have come up with the actual rocket. It was made in Iran. I don't think it would have been a misfired Israeli rocket. Hezbollah says it was fired by Israel. When's the last time Israel had access to an Iranian rocket? So the question is, how does Israel respond? And, there are debates. Should it hit a drone base in Lebanon? All of that's just tit for tat. What Israel has to do, and it's just not going to do it because the United States won't let it, Israel has to go and cut off the head of the octopus. The octopus puts out its tentacles. One of its tentacles, one of its arms is Hezbollah. Another one is Hamas. Another one is the Houthis. And there are others as well, Islamic Jihad. It has to go against Iran. And they should have gone against Iran when Iran fired 300 rockets. But the United States persuaded it to have a minimal response because the United States and other countries, including some Arab countries, helped knock down the 300 rockets and drones that were aimed at Israeli civilians. Civilians, talk about war crimes. They were hoping to kill people in Tel Aviv. We're not talking about soldiers. We're talking about families. But there's no UN investigation. There's no ICC investigation. There's no ICJ investigation. Speaking of which, there is now a full-fledged famine going on in the Sudan, particularly in Darfur. Remember the name Darfur? There was a genocide there some years ago. There's a new genocide taking place. According to even the New York Times, which rarely reports on things like this, there's real starvation going on in Sudan. People are dying of starvation, unlike what's going on in Gaza, where people are missing dessert and maybe having 2 meals a day instead of 3 meals a day. Nobody's dying of starvation. There's no starvation in Gaza. There's no real hunger in Gaza. People are getting 3,000 calories a day. But in Darfur and the Sudan, there's real hunger, real starvation. And the military, according to the New York Times, is actually blocking food from coming in, and people are dying. Will there be a single demonstration on any campus in the United States? Don't count on it. There won't be a single demonstration. Will any of the squad protest in Congress? Black Lives Matter. No, not to the squad if the Black lives are being taken by Black people. Black lives only matter when they're taken by white people, by policemen, or by Jews, by Israel. You can't have that. Black lives do matter, and they matter as much when they're being taken by other Blacks in the Sudan. And so we're just seeing this utter hypocrisy going on. We will not see a single protest. Elizabeth Warren won't say a word. I I doubt that that Kamala Harris will say very much. She said, "I can't remain silent in the face of what's going on in Gaza. What's going on in Gaza is that Hamas is using human shields and killing babies and children by using them as human shields. I can't remain silent. What's going on in the Sudan? How can she remain silent about that? How can other Democrats and others remain silent about what's going on in the Sudan? It's absolutely disgusting, and it's a double standard. You want to have the world come to your side, fine. All you need to do is claim that Jews are at fault or that Israel's at fault. The world will come to your side. But no matter what happens, if it's just other people of a minority going after another minority, that's page 86. If it's in the Times at all, on the bottom. It was in the Times, but we haven't heard any responses at all. Incredible hypocrisy, incredible double standard. Speaking of double standards, let's turn to the topic of the day. President Biden has now worked with my former colleague Lawrence Tribe to try to weaken the Supreme Court. Now, if the shoe were on the other foot, if the Supreme Court were controlled by Democrats, if most of the appointments were made by Democrats, as the Warren Court was when I was a law clerk and when Tribe was a law clerk, Tribe would be on the other side. He would be saying, "Oh, you can't do things like that. You can't have term limits on the Supreme Court. That's unconstitutional." And all Biden and Tribe want to do is use this as a campaign issue against their political opponents. Nothing can be done. You can't create term limits. I'm actually in favor of term limits. If I were rewriting the Constitution, I would probably say judges and justices should serve 15 years, 18 years, 20 years. 10 is too short, 25 is too long. Somewhere in between. I would support that. I think that makes sense. But the Constitution has a specific provision in it. It says that justices shall serve during good behavior. Those are the words of the Constitution, which means until they resign, retire, or until they die. And that's been what's happened since 1793. But Lawrence Tribe and his student, Biden, think you can change all that legislatively. No, you can't. You have to do it by constitutional amendment. You think it's going to be a constitutional amendment during this campaign season? Of course not. For a constitutional amendment, you need, oversized votes, states, everything. It can never happen. We've only amended the Constitution a little over 24 times, and we're not going to do it this time. And he also wants ethics rules. Okay, I'm in favor of ethics rules as well, and I think that you can do those probably without amending the Constitution if you have legislative actions. But then we get to the real point of what they want. They don't care about the structure of the Supreme Court, about term limits. They care about the fact that they lost in the Supreme Court. They lost Roe versus Wade. That's when it really started. Let's pack the court. Let's turn the court more to the left. And then, of course, the most recent decision involving presidential immunity. You can't change that without a constitutional amendment as well. What the justices decided in a decision, which I think may have gone too far on some of the evidentiary issues, but they decided that as a matter of constitutional law, presidents should have immunity along with members of Congress and along with judges. Does anybody want to take away the judicial immunity of judges, the immunity of judges from civil liability? Terrible, terrible decisions, immunizing judges from doing terrible, terrible things that were clearly beyond the scope of their legitimate responsibility. But immunity is part of the constitutional structure. And so they're not happy, the Democrats. I'm not happy with all of these decisions either. I don't think Roe versus Wade should have been overruled. I think the Supreme Court should have simply decided the case that was before it. 15 weeks in Mississippi, uphold that and say, wait until the next case comes up when a state passes a statute saying there's no constitutional right to abortion. We'll decide that case then. They didn't do that. So, just like I was opposed to the judicial reforms proposed in Israel, most of them, because judicial reforms generally, both in Israel and the United States, are proposed not to improve the quality of the Supreme Court in a neutral fashion. They're proposed because one side doesn't like what the other side has done. The Israelis on the right didn't like the fact that the Israeli Supreme Court tended to be left-leaning. And the left in the United States, the tribes, don't like the fact that the Supreme Court today seems to be right-leaning. It was left-leaning before, that was okay, but now that it's right-leaning, let's go back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Let's pack the court, let's impose term limits, let's do all of these things that will weaken the court, not to structurally help the Supreme Court to make it a better institution, but to make it an institution more compatible with the politics of our side. And, that's what's going on today. The rule of law is being weaponized by both sides, more the Democrats today than the Republicans, using the criminal justice system to go after Donald Trump. My book, Get Trump. I'm not a political supporter of Donald Trump, but I am a legal supporter of the Constitution. And the Constitution cannot be abused by weaponizing the criminal justice system. As I've said before in this show, the worst abuse, akin, maybe even worse than McCarthyism, because McCarthyism basis in the law, although it was dead wrong, completely wrong. When I was a college student, when I was a law school student, I fought against it. But what the New York district attorney did to Donald Trump was worse than anything I've ever seen. Making up a crime out of whole cloth, creating a crime out of nothing. Taking a misdemeanor that was barred by the statute of limitations and turning it into a viable felony. Just wrong. And I think the same thing was true with the January 6th cases. And the Supreme Court has basically said, look, you can't just stretch criminal statutes beyond what they were intended to cover. And we're seeing a lot of litigation on that now. I'm representing one of the young men who was indicted for a felony for simply trespassing in the Capitol when he was waved in by the police. They denied him his ability to take the bar, his graduation from law school, even though he was a good student, because he followed the police. The police said, hey, come in as long as you're basically not destroying any property, not doing anything. And he didn't. He just went there, showed his opposition to the election. He was wrong, in my view, and I've told him that, even though I'm representing him. I think the election was fair, and I think that Joe Biden won the election fair and square. That's not what he thought. That's not what he thinks. It's not what Donald Trump thinks. But that's America. We can have disagreements, and those disagreements can take the form of protests. And when the protests cross the line and become crimes, like they did last week in the District of Columbia, when Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke in Congress, and many senators and congressmen, almost all but one, Democrats, refused to listen, in violation of the spirit of the First Amendment, and in Kamala Harris's case, in violation of her constitutional obligation to preside. When that happened, there were protests, but they were just not protests. The statue of, I think it was Christopher Columbus, was defaced. Other statutes were written on. Threats were made. Property crimes occurred. People wrote, I guess you have a constitutional right to say, we're with Hamas. Hamas is coming. We welcome Hamas. We love rapists. We love people who behead babies. You can say all of those things. You just can't write them on statues that are the property of the United States of America. And you can't tear down an American flag from Union Station and burn it. You can burn your own flag, as Justice Brennan once said. If he saw somebody burning a flag, he would do two things. He would defend his right to do so and then punch him in the mouth for being such an un-American, horrible person. I guess that reflects my attitude too. I'm too old to punch him in the mouth, but I would verbally punch him and defend his right to burn the flag. But you can't burn somebody else's flag. And you can't burn a flag owned by the United States of America. And you can't deface statutes owned by the United States of America. Where are the District of Columbia police? Where is the mayor of the District of Columbia? Why aren't these law violators being punished? Why are only the law violators on the Republican side being subjected to felonies? I'm not making any comparisons between the cases, but if you say nobody's above the law, that means these people who are writing Hamas is coming on statues are not above the law. They should be prosecuted, and they're not being prosecuted. So, we have a real problem with the law. Look, I'm a legal realist. I went to Yale Law School. I studied the work of Jerome Frank. I think of myself as a very pragmatic realist in the spirit of Oliver Wendell Holmes and others. I don't believe the law is sacred, that the law comes from some mountaintop and that it's neutral. As you know, the reason that judges in England wear wigs and funny uniforms is that they should all look the same, because the law is supposed to be impersonal. I don't believe any of that, but the law is supposed to be nonpartisan. At the very least, it's not supposed to depend on who is in power. It was Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers who said the most dangerous, not the second most dangerous, the most dangerous thing would be for impeachment to be turned into a political weapon, whereby the outcome of an impeachment trial would turn on who had the most votes. That's exactly what has happened. Yes, the Democratic House impeaches. Yes, the Republican Senate doesn't convict. That's what's going on, and both sides have been misusing impeachment. The Republicans went after Mayorkas. You may not like what he's done on the border, but he didn't commit an impeachable crime. And I am convinced if Donald Trump were to be elected, it would be just a few months before the Democrats, if they control the House, would come up with resolutions of impeachment. I'm sure Professor Tribe would draft them and would say that they're perfectly constitutional, as he did about the two unconstitutional impeachment provisions that were voted on by the Democratic Congress. So whether you're a Democrat or Republican, whether you're a Harvard Law School professor or a citizen who just cares about our Constitution, it doesn't matter. The Constitution is what makes us an independent country under the rule of law. One of the books I'm most proud of is a tiny little book, just a tiny little book. I don't know, is it 100 pages even? No, it's less than that, that I wrote about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and my little introduction. I carry this around with me, although I pretty much know the Constitution by heart at this point. And sometimes, you have to look things up. And the Constitution is really important, and the rule of law is really important, and we're losing it. We're losing it primarily these days to the Democrats. It's ironic because the Democrats are saying, oh my God, if you vote for Trump, he will turn us away from democracy and against the rule of law. And Trump has made some really outrageous statements, telling Christians the other day, all you have to do is vote once for me. If you vote for me once, I'll solve all the problems. Then you're never going to vote again. You don't have to vote again. That just doesn't sound like America. We want Christians to vote in every election, just the way we want Muslims and Jews to vote in every election. But the fact is that although it's the Democrats who think the Republicans will take democracy away from us, and maybe they will, and you have a right to vote if you believe that, against them. But so far, it's been the Democrats who have been denying us our constitutional rights. It's the Democrats who have been weaponizing the criminal justice system against Donald Trump, the impeachment system against Donald Trump. So, who's calling the kettle? I think both parties are at fault here. And I worry deeply about the enduring rule of law in the United States and our enduring Constitution. It's under threat from both sides. All right, let's turn to some letters. Professor, during the speech of Prime Minister Netanyahu, hundreds of pro-Hamas protesters went to Union Station, lowered the American flag, burnt it, raised the Palestinian flag. They defaced numerous monuments. The Democratic mayor did nothing to stop it. Harris has publicly said she admires the spirit of those protesters. How can you vote for her? Well, let's see what the Democrats do. The statement about Harris is out of context. It didn't refer to these protesters. I'm worried that the Democrats have applied a double standard, that the Black Lives Matter people and these folks in Washington have received far, far, far more sympathetic treatment. And we know that Harris did raise money for bail for the Black Lives Matter protesters. I have no problem with that. Everybody should get bail if they're subject to bail, and they shouldn't be denied bail because of money. But if you selectively only raise bail money for one group of protesters and not others, you're not being neutral. All right. The Prime Minister of Israel gave one of the most wonderful speeches I have heard in years. There was passion and love for his home country in abundance. Israel has always had memorable prime ministers, and Mr. Netanyahu was certainly among them. Simply wonderful. Okay, that's one point of view. Now, let me read you another point of view. Nancy Pelosi. She said that Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech was, quote, the worst speech ever delivered by a foreign leader. Either she is a liar or an ignoramus. There's no third alternative. Or a bigot. Netanyahu's speech, you may not agree with everything. You may not think it was the best speech ever made. But to call it the worst speech ever delivered by a foreign leader does not pass the perjury test. It's an opinion, so she can't be indicted for perjury. But she's making it up. It's just not true. It was not the worst speech. It was one of the best speeches. I was there for his first speech, which was memorable. It was Churchill-like. I was sitting in the front row with Mrs. Netanyahu and Elie Wiesel and Mrs. Wiesel. I was invited to do the same thing for this speech. I wish I could have done it, but as you know, my unkosher hamstring was torn. Getting better. It's getting a little better now. And I couldn't go. I watched every minute of it. I watched it in spirit. I wish I could have been there. And I got a nice letter about that. Let's see if I can find it. It's so nice. I'm going to look for it. My Jewish mom suggests you ice your hamstring 3 times a day. I've actually been going in the hot tub and heating it, and make yourself some chicken soup and call her in the morning. All right, if you give me your mom's phone number, I will call her in the morning and tell her that the chicken soup has cured me. I'm feeling better. I actually walked today to the mailbox about a quarter of a mile and with a cane, but it's getting better. I think it's on the road to healing. So thank you all for your good wishes. I got a lot of letters. I got a lot of letters about that, but I would say that 90% of the letters I got really were, how can you vote for Democrats? You must support Republicans. Let's see. There's one about that might be. Hey, Dersh, if you vote Democrat this time, you may not be may not be in Israel 4 years later. Maybe you should vote for the guy that recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Hey, I was there when that recognition occurred. I was in the White House, first of all, and then I was in Jerusalem. I was at the opening of the Israeli embassy, and the ambassador, United States ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, is a good friend of mine. And I got a signed little brick from the new embassy, signed by Prime Minister Netanyahu. And so, yes, I recognize that Trump did a great thing by recognizing Jerusalem. All the previous presidents had said they would, none of them did, but he did. And so that's certainly an element in my thinking when I decide ultimately who to vote for. I'm going to make a balanced judgment, and I will let you know. Okay. As an American Israeli from Maryland, I was appalled that my Senator, Chris Van Hollen, boycotted Bibi's speech. Not showing up is an insult to almost 10 million Israelis and to many, many millions of Americans, Jewish and non-Jewish, let me add. I will not be voting for him in the future. Neither would I. I will not vote or contribute to any politician who boycotted Netanyahu. I'm done with them. I will not do it. As I've said before, don't count on me as a member of the Democratic Party. I am not a member of the Democratic Party. I vote for Democrats more than I vote for Republicans. Don't know who I'm going to vote for this time. But as Ronald Reagan said, I haven't left the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has left me. And I've gotten lots and lots and lots of letters urging me to support Trump. Now, there's a big difference between leaving the Democratic Party and becoming a Republican, or not voting for Harris and voting for Trump. I haven't made that leap yet. I'm thinking about it all the time. I'm getting all kind of advice from my family, from my friends, and from my audience. And so I will make my own decision. Alan, you have a moral obligation to call out the Democratic Party and encourage the Jewish citizens to vote against them. I have called out the Democratic Party. I have called them out by name. I name the names of the people who boycotted Netanyahu. I call out the Democratic Party, but I'm not prepared to tell people who to vote for at this point because there are so many other issues that are at stake. There are very few voters who are single issue voters. And so people have to make their own decisions. But I urge voters, anybody who is supportive of Israel, whether Jewish or not, to take into account the fact that the anti-Israel sentiment comes largely from the Democratic Party these days, that all but one of the boycotters were Democrats, that the worst bigots in the House are the Squad, and the worst bigots in the Senate are Democrats, including one who's Jewish, Bernie Sanders. And take that into account and decide who you're voting for, but then balance that against other issues, against the economy, against the border, against foreign policy, against abortion rights, against gay rights. You have to, we live in a complex world, and voting is a complex issue. And I'm a complex person, so I'm going to think about all these issues before I decide who I'm going to vote for. All right. Professor, the state of Louisiana just passed a law where the 10 Commandments shall be displayed in schools. The Constitution itself does not mention separation of church and state. It was mentioned by Thomas Jefferson, but not in the Constitution. But he mentioned it in his writings and in his letters. And he talks about separation of church and state. Actually, separation of church and state is Roger Williams, a Protestant minister from Rhode Island, who talked about separating the garden from the wilderness, the garden being the church, the wilderness being the state. So the concept goes before the Constitution, but the Constitution itself doesn't say separation of church and state. The Constitution itself, the First Amendment, has the Establishment Clause. Says Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion. But it does not say state legislatures. How does this discrepancy been resolved? It's a very interesting point. Originally, the purpose of the Establishment Clause was to make sure that Congress, that the federal government, didn't choose between or among religions. Many of the states in 1793 had established religions. Massachusetts had an established religion. Others had established religions. All Protestant religions, but different branches of Protestantism. And so the framers, when it said not to establish a religion, said that the federal government shouldn't pick one religion and establish it. But over time, that amendment, the First Amendment, has been interpreted differently. And it applies now to the states as well through the 14th Amendment. And as applied to the states, it has been broadened. And it doesn't allow for a state to establish not only a religion, but religion as distinguished from secularity. So, for example, a state couldn't say you have to believe in God in order to vote. That would violate both provisions of the First Amendment, Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause. So both have been interpreted to apply not only to religion, but to non-religion. And every American citizen has the right to have whatever views they want to have on religion, and without being required to take any kind of an oath or statement. In England, you had to take an oath. You had to believe in the Trinity. You had to believe in the divinity of Jesus. And in about 1750, they passed what was called the Jew Law in Parliament, which said, no, you can now be a Jew and be a citizen. That lasted 1 year. The royal family, the media, many in the legislature said, no, we can't allow Jews to have the same rights as Christians. Oh my God, Jews having the same rights as Christians. So they abolished the law. I have a copy, an actual copy of the 1750 law. I don't have it with me here on Martha's Vineyard, but I have it in New York. And next time, I think I did show it on one of my shows, but I'll show it again to show you how George Washington was the first head of state of any country in the history of the world to recognize the equality of the Jewish people. He said, to bigotry, we will have no support. And every religion has the right to practice its own religion and sit under its own fig tree, as long as you are loyal to the United States of America. George Washington was a truly, truly great man. But the letter that he wrote to the Jewish communities of Newport and Savannah, I have the first newspaper reports of those letters, and I have a book that contains the letter to the Savannah community, and I treasure those because the United States was the first country in the history of the world ever to recognize equality of Jews and Christians and members of other faiths as well. See you tomorrow.